on this episode of Rebel Spirit Radio.
Sidereal uses the visible sky, and it says, okay, let's find out exactly where the sun is when someone's born and see exactly what constellation that's in. So the real pickle for us in the West is that when we hear our tropical sign, or what we think is just our sign, Leo, whatever it is, we assume that that's where the sun was when we were born. But most of the time it's not. So many times, for example, a sun in Leo is actually a sun in Cancer. And the sun was actually in front of literally the constellation of Cancer when the person was born. So I still think both are valid. They're just used for different things, right? So you've got, tropical, I think, represents more of the physical self because you're dealing more with the seasons and thus the very stagnant or stable rotation of the Earth around the sun. So it's based on that. And so it does tend to show more of the physical self. But then you have Sidereal, which is the actual stars where everything was actually placed. And here I do believe that that speaks more to the fundamental self, or you might say the more spiritual self.
Welcome to Rebel Spirit Radio, exploring the frontiers of spirituality, consciousness, the esoteric, and humanity's sacred relationship with the living earth. I'm your host, Nick Mather, and in this episode I am joined by astrologer Athen Chimenti to discuss true sidereal astrology. Athen explains the differences between sidereal and tropical astrology, the 13th sign of Ophiuchus and its significance in true sidereal astrology. We explore the practical applications of both systems, the importance of understanding holistic philosophies, and possible future system changes seen through transits and astrological aspects. Also, please be sure to like and subscribe to this podcast on whatever platform you use to listen to or view podcasts. Your support is truly appreciated. Hey, Nick here. Before I begin this week's episode, I wanted to make a request that you like or subscribe to the podcast on whatever platform you use to listen to or view podcasts. I know you just heard this, and it's in the intro every week, but right now, for example, the stats on the platform I use to distribute the podcast shows that 9 people follow the podcast in its audio version. And I know one of those is me. I also know that I have way more listeners than that. So if you enjoy what I'm doing here on Rebel Spirit Radio, then please take a second to help me out. Subscribing or following is totally free and will only take a few seconds of your time, and it will really help the podcast grow. And I'll also be immensely grateful. So now on to my interview with Athen Chimenti. Athen Chimenti is an astrologer, educator, and leading expert in the field of true sidereal astrology. He is dedicated to spreading the word about true sidereal and how powerful it is at bringing clarity and direction to people's lives. Athen has helped more than 5,000 people from around the world gain clarity through his astrology readings. He has taught more than 100 astrologers to become professionals in the field and thousands more through his video course. Athen, welcome to Rebel Spirit Radio.
Oh, thank you so much, Nick. Great to be here.
Yeah, I am curious about the astrology that you practice. I've heard of sidereal astrology before, and I know many astrologers and have a little bit of an interest in it myself. But I thought that the best place to begin would be with a definition of sidereal astrology, but I'm also curious about true sidereal astrology.
Right. So, yeah, what I practice is what I call true sidereal, but there is, of course, the fundamental sidereal. So, the easiest way to describe it is that there's basically 2 forms of astrology, 2 main forms of astrology used in the world today. One is what's called tropical astrology, which is what most of us in the West are using. So, that's pretty much what most of us are familiar with when we hear our sun sign, or we check out like the horoscope or whatever. It's our tropical. So tropical here refers to the fact that in the West, we're primarily using the seasons for the determining what the sign is. And that's why, like right at the spring equinox, it starts Aries, and then every month and for almost exactly 30 days, you have each of the signs. And so it stays fixed this way to the seasons. However, the seasons relative to the constellations are slowly changing. An easier way of saying that is basically the sun does not return to the same point in the zodiac every year. Now, it's a very subtle difference. It only changes 1 degree. So if there's 360 degrees in a circle, it only changes 1 degree every 72 years.
Mm.
So it's very, very subtle. Okay. But when tropical first became widely adopted, it was about 2,000 years ago. Okay. So this is like the late Roman Empire in the West. So since that time, now, because of this slight change, which is called precession, if we want to get technical with it, precession, because of precession, we're now almost a full sign difference, usually a full sign different. And with true sidereal, which I'll explain, is up to 2 signs different. But basically, you have tropical, which is the seasonal system. It's what we're all using. And then you have sidereal, which takes into account precession, basically. So sidereal uses the visible sky, and it says, okay, let's find out exactly where the sun is when someone's born and see exactly what constellation that's in. So the real pickle for us in the West is that when we hear our tropical sign, or what we think is just our sign, Leo, whatever it is, we assume that that's where the sun was when we were born. But most of the time it's not. So many times, for example, a sun in Leo is actually a sun in Cancer. And the sun was actually in front of literally the constellation of Cancer when the person was born. So I still think both are valid. They're just used for different things, right? So you've got, tropical, I think, represents more of the physical self because you're dealing more with the seasons and thus the very stagnant or stable rotation of the Earth around the sun. So it's based on that. And so it does tend to show more of the physical self. But then you have sidereal, which is the actual stars where everything was actually placed. And here I do believe that that speaks more to the fundamental self, or you might say the more spiritual stuff. So I still think both are valid. I still think both are accurate. It's just with tropical, you're using basically a seasonal system. So it's, I think, opinion, less astrology and more seasonal methodology, right? Because they've basically taken the zodiac and they've overlaid it on top of the seasons. And if you believe we're all going through cycles in life, of course, then if we're born during certain seasons, we're going to represent certain qualities. So it's the same cycle of life, the zodiac, so they just use that cycle of life over the seasons. And so still accurate, but it's a seasonal system. And I think that distinction needs to be made. So tropical, seasonal, more of a physical self, in my opinion. And then you've got sidereal, which is more, in my opinion, more astrological in that it actually references the sky. And here it represents more of the spiritual or fundamental self.
Okay. There are a lot of questions, but the one that is immediately on my mind is this distinction that you're making with the tropical looking at the physical and the sidereal with the more spiritual. And I think on the website, your website, you refer to it as like the essence of the person. And what I'm curious about is the use of sidereal astrology then for what is sometimes referred to as mundane astrology, looking at kind of world events. How would that fit in with this notion that it speaks more towards the spiritual?
Right. So you can practice obviously mundane astrology with tropical, or you could, use it with sidereal. So you can use obviously the same things. Other things would be like synastry for compatibility or whatever else. You can of course do that between systems. And really, it's worth mentioning here that really there's a lot in common between tropical and sidereal, because there's other things than just signs in astrology. We also have houses and aspects, and these actually all have their own systems, so you can interchange them and stuff. So really, when we're talking about tropical and sidereal, it's really just the zodiac system, just the way of determining the zodiac sign. So of course, then you can practice mundane and all this kind of stuff with it. So yeah, then it kind of goes there without saying that, tropical might show more of the physical stuff that we're experiencing collectively. And then sidereal, maybe more of the spiritual things that we're experiencing collectively.
All right. That's what I thought, but I thought I should ask. Now, you mentioned like the houses and the aspects. Are they read in a similar manner? So, for example, is what the first house represents in tropical, is that the same? Does it represent the same thing in sidereal?
Yeah, it does. It does. So there is, like I said, the Western. So in the West, obviously, we're just talking about now geographically the West.
Right.
So geographically in the West, you can use obviously any system. Like I'm from the West and I use sidereal. So it's just that like the vast majority of those in the West are using tropical. But so the more popular one for sidereal is the East. So in India, they're using like 99% of astrology is sidereal over there. So you can think of it as like the West is more predominantly tropical, and the East is more predominantly sidereal in that sense. But I'm sorry, what was the question? I kind of lost my train of thought there.
Oh,
Difference.
I was asking about like the houses and if
Oh, right,
they have the same meaning in each system. Yeah.
right, right. So in the West, we have like a way of interpreting, and in the East, they have a way of interpreting, right? There's a lot of overlap though, because where a lot of like modern astrology comes from today, West and East, comes from kind of the Babylonian, pre-Babylonian period. Now, a lot would argue that it dates back much further in India, and I would agree with that. But a lot of the way they're using it today, there's a lot of overlap because it kind of a lot of the techniques were birthed during that time, the ones we use today. So in that way, there isn't a whole lot of difference in terms of interpretation, except for when you start to practice specifically Hindu astrology, or what's also called Vedic astrology. So if you're practicing Hindu or Vedic astrology, there's still a lot of similarities, but it is a very different system in that they're using very different techniques and even subtle differences in the way they're describing it. So for all intents and purposes, keeping it very simple, yes, Leo is Leo. And we figured out that Leo has these qualities of like self-expression, playfulness, whatever. And for the most part, both are going to agree, the West and the East. But there is this slight difference in terms of maybe some of the nuances, some of the details. And for example, like in Hindu astrology, they're gonna take Leo and they're gonna divide it up into even more parts, and then you can become an even more specific Leo. It's called a nakshatra, or even more specific, which is a pada. So you can get more detailed with it. But generally, for all intents and purposes, when you're reading the sun sign, we're talking about the outer self, or if you're reading the moon sign, it's more of the inner self and things of this nature. Now there is one, I think, main difference between true sidereal and let's just say tropical is that mainly with the ascendant. So for those that don't know, the ascendant is basically the constellation that was rising in the east when someone was born. And the ancients, a lot of the ancients would describe this as like who the person was to become, like what their role would be in society. So if it was, say, Leo rising, they might be an entertainer or a creative person or a leader or something of this kind, which is kind of more of a Leo quality. But in tropical, they are going to describe it more like the physical self, like I said. And that's why for those that do follow Western astrology, the big three is the sun, moon, and the ascendant. And the ascendant is often described as this sort of persona or the mask that we wear. So here, a Leo in tropical would be someone who presents themselves as a Leo, someone who looks like a Leo, maybe has some Leo qualities physically. Whereas with true sidereal, what it tends to show is, again, more of a soul. It's more of who the person's destined to become. So the planets are visible. They're there. They're very physical. Even in sidereal, you can see the planets. So the sun, the moon, all those, you can see those physically, except for really the ascendant. And it's because this is not an actual literal part of the self as much as it's what's life helping this person develop. So if you were to read your rising sign in true sidereal literally and say, this is like my persona, this is the mask I wear, it wouldn't be very accurate, right? Because you'd be reading it from that more physical lens. What would be accurate is if you look at your life experiences, you'll see a lot of them are becoming more Leo, and it's helping you become more Leo, but certainly not what you were born with. Whereas in the tropical system, you could read the Leo as more of the physical self. So again, it does come back to like what I think is that fundamental difference of what tropical is showing as being more physical and sidereal being more spiritual. And so in that way, it can change interpretations a bit. But to answer your question directly, for the most part, they're interpreted the same. And again, it's really because the only difference between tropical and sidereal is just the zodiac system. It's just a way of determining what the sign is. And once we found the sign, we can interpret it the way we normally would.
Okay, thank you for that. I find it really interesting just from a perspective of studying world religions and history a little bit that the East is more spiritual in the systems than in the West is more physical, because that does seem to speak to how this manifests in regular reality. One of the questions that I have for you is in terms of the reading of your horoscope, for example. I know that in the West, the focus has been on the sun sign for a long time. And so people will identify as their sun sign. And I've done some research, and not a whole bunch, in things like Hellenistic astrology, where when you look at the horoscope, it's really based on the ascendant, because that's where all the transits are. How does it work in the sidereal? Is it more sun focused, or like with any kind of transits, is that going to be based on the ascendant?
Right. So if we're talking just about, so again, we kind of want to separate the zodiac system from like the East and the West here. So
Right.
zodiac wise, tropical and sidereal, it's just the way of determining the signs.
Hmm.
But if we look at it from West versus East, yes, it's very different, right? So the West, as you said, it gives preference to the sun sign. And that's why all the horoscopes and everything are all centered around the sun sign. And just like you would deduce, in the East, it's primarily the moon sign, actually.
Okay.
So over there, they give more preference to the moon.
Hmm.
And they consider that a more positive force. They actually see the sun as a more difficult force to work with, harsher force, or what they call more of a malefic. Whereas in the West, they won't call the moon a malefic, but it's very obvious that they're obviously having a more challenging working with the emotional and spiritual, because the sun is the more outer ego self and the moon is the more inner spiritual self. And it's really a dichotomy you can draw in life. And, the sun just represents everything that's more yang, and the moon just represents everything that's more yin. So obviously the West, being more yang driven culture, is going to have more issue working with yin energy, and vice versa. So for those that are traditionally, East, they're going to be predominantly moon based or yin based and have more difficulty with the yang. So that's where, like, what I feel like I provide is a more balanced approach. So I like to see them both as equal, both as equally important. I mean, if you look up at the sky, it's like a total synchronicity that they're both almost the exact same size.
Right.
And with astrology, what we do is it's all about association. It's all about symbolism. So if two things in the sky are the same size, it goes without saying that these are two equally important parts of the self. And what you have here is just the more outer consciousness of the self, which is the sun, and the more inner consciousness of the self, which is the moon. Both equals, just polarities to one another. One's the yang, one's the yin. And what's quite uncanny is you see this polarity continuing, this pattern continuing through the planets. So you have these pairs, in this case, sun and moon. Then you have like a gatekeeper, which is Mercury, which is the planet of communication. And he's the gatekeeper to the interpersonal, which is Venus and Mars. And Venus and Mars are the yin and yang of the interpersonal. So that's where we get the masculine and feminine. Then we have the asteroid belt, and then we have Jupiter and Saturn, another polarity. And these deal with manifestation, how we manifest our life. One's yin, one's yang. And then there's Chiron in between those, and then Uranus and Neptune, and then Pluto's the last gatekeeper. So this pattern of yin and yang repeats, but in this case, with the sun and moon, these are the most fundamental, right? They're the largest in the sky. They are symbolic for the largest parts of ourself. And here we're just talking about a yin and yang polarity. And I'm a big advocate of, like, if you want to read only the sun and moon in the chart, you can see like 80+% of the individual just looking at these two forces, because of how, prominent they are, let's say, in the personality.
Okay. Yeah, I remember reading that on the website, and that was one of the things I wanted to ask you about because I liked the yin and yang sort of aspect to it, and it's a different way of viewing the sun and the moon from the tropical point of view. And I wanted to ask about because I know in the traditional astrology, I shouldn't say traditional, I'll say the tropical astrology, the planets ended at Saturn because we didn't know the other ones. And those outer planets now are seen as being more like generational markers, perhaps. And I'm curious if it's the same thing in the sidereal. I would imagine so, but how are they interpreted any differently?
Yeah, that's a great question because, like you said, like everything up to Saturn was incorporated into both systems. Obviously, because they were visible, they are visible. Only up to Saturn we can see with the naked eye. Then came, the mid 1700s, mid to late 1700s, we discovered Uranus. Now, at this point, this is where the West really started to diverge from the East. Okay, and we're talking specifically Hindu astrology here. So in Hindu astrology, they don't even use the trans-Saturnian planets at all. Okay, now there's obviously some that do, right? We're in modern world and there's a lot of mixed match, but for the most part, they don't use it. So, and I totally, like agree with that in many ways, because what we want to do with astrology is like we want to be able to really describe the physical aspects of the self in the way that, like, okay, here's the strongest part of your ego. The same way that I was saying, you could even just look at the sun and moon. You can just look up to Saturn. Now, after Saturn, you need a telescope, right? And again, we're talking symbolism. So what this symbolically means is that as you're going through the planets in order, you're getting deeper into the unconscious, right? So you have sun and moon, the most visible outer and inner parts of the self. Then you go to the Mercury, Venus, Mars, and then this is like a little bit deeper, still pretty surface, right? But a little deeper. Then you have Jupiter and Saturn, which is more deep because that has to do with like your beliefs of life, which are things you don't see in someone right away. And then after Saturn, the symbolism of needing a telescope is symbolic that you're basically now going into the unconscious. Okay. Not fully into the unconscious because we're able to play around with it, but you're starting to play around with things that are unseen with the naked eye or unseen to, to another person. So here, yeah, so Uranus and Neptune are the polarity. Uranus is the yang, Neptune is the yin. I see them as gateways to the higher self. If you think of it as kind of Jungian terms, it's like we have the ego and then we have all this unconscious that needs to be somewhat integrated to live a more whole and balanced life. And Uranus and Neptune are the sort of mediums to help us do that. They're like a link to our egos, let's say. And Uranus is the link that says, listen to your excitement. This is the yang connection to our higher self. Like, listen to your excitement, do what excites you. We've heard that mantra. And then Neptune is the yin, which says, follow your soul. And we've heard this mantra too, follow what's so important to you. So both are, again, equally important, but they're helping us become integrated with our higher self, which is the part that is listening to our excitement and is soul guided, right? That more holistic self. So you can see how valuable it is to be able to see, okay, what is your Uranus? What is your Neptune? And then that can help us become more whole and more integrated. But these planets move extremely slow. The further out you go, the slower they move, right? And I think that's what you're alluding to about the collective, because now you're starting to look at more generational kinds of things, not full on generations the way we've classified them, but more shorter terms. So like, Uranus, for example, is 7.5 years in a sign, Neptune's 16. But you get this more collective kind of energy when you're looking at them. So this has more to do with how that generation views life, what they do to induce change in the world, what they do to find peace and follow their soul. So you can read them both as the deeper part of the self. But of course, the same way in Jungian psychology can be done, the unconscious is connected to the collective unconscious. And everything that's going on in our unconscious is playing or dancing with everything that's going on in the collective. So same with astrology, same with these planets, you can look at them as the individual connection to the true self or what's going on in a generational physically on Earth in a sort of collective sense. And both I think are equally important, equally valid. But you can also see how, again, it's not totally necessary to be able to do this. And I think that's why in the East, they just keep it up to Saturn.
Okay. Yeah, I was kind of curious because I'm Gen X and there's a marker. And so in my tropical natal chart, and I want to ask you about natal charts here in a moment, there's essentially this conjunction of, I think it's Uranus and Pluto, maybe Neptune. I should have double checked this. But when I looked at the sidereal chart, they're not even in the same signs. All these planets are in fairly different signs. And I found that really interesting because that seems, if you pay attention to the signs, I mean, the planets from a visible aspect would still be conjunct, but from looking at the houses, these are in different houses. I think Uranus and Pluto are still in the seventh house, but they're in different signs in the chart.
Different signs or different houses? You probably mean different
Well,
houses, right?
no, they're in this. Well, the one I've got, if it's Uranus and Pluto, they're both in the seventh house, but Uranus is in Virgo and Pluto is in Leo.
Oh, right. So that just means they were on the cusp, right?
Yeah.
So you're probably born sometime in the late Pluto. Yeah, it'd be late 60s. No,
Mm-hmm.
is that right? Yeah,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Tomorrow's
So
my
we have
birthday, actually.
Oh, okay. Happy birthday.
Thank you.
So Sun and Leo is
Yeah.
great for podcasting and stuff, by the way.
Yeah.
But yeah, so Pluto, late Leo, and then yeah, Uranus, early Virgo. So we see that collectively. Like the late 60s was what? It was a total revolution,
Mm-hmm.
and that's the Uranus energy.
Right.
Uranus is revolution and change, and Pluto is the transformation. So huge revolutionary transformation coming out of the 60s. So we saw that collectively through those planets, but now we could say that you were born under that same energy.
Mm-hmm.
So you and your whole sort of, not so much all of, your generation, but particularly this late 60s
Mm-hmm.
children, let's say, you guys are here to induce this kind of stuff. You're here,
Right.
you're, let's say, born in the energy of this. And so you're here to induce that change and transform and stuff. So yeah, so that's a great example of, how to read it. You can read it like collectively, like for example, like right now this year we've had Jupiter and Uranus conjunct, and
Mm-hmm.
this means a lot of innovation and a lot of forward thinking, a lot of future oriented kind of stuff, focused with, anything that's changing the world or technology and stuff is very, very prominent. And so anyone born right now is obviously they're going to have that in their birth chart because the birth chart's a snapshot of when they were born. And so that's going to represent in their personality, so
Right.
it's really not like this whole woo woo thing. I mean, astrology is basically just telling us like where we're at in these cycles.
Mm-hmm.
And all we've done over these, thousands of years is we just figured out like, hey, we can use the planets to let us know where we're at in these certain cycles. Like if the universe is going through cycles, which I believe it is more than just the seasons, then the planets are just timekeepers to help us keep
Right.
track of where we are in these cycles, And so it's not like totally out there to think that, the whole world is sharing an experience at certain times, and
Right.
anyone born during that energy is going to hold that energy for the rest of their life,
Mm-hmm.
so to speak.
Yeah. Yeah. It reminds me of, I think it was Stan Groff who noted that he likened it to a clock. And he says, the clock doesn't make it be 1 p.m. It's just a measurement, and that the looking at the astrology of things is similar to looking at a watch, that it's just giving us those markers, right?
That's how
Since
I see
we,
it. Yeah.
yeah, since we are on the outer planets and whatnot, I did want to ask, because one of the main conversations that seems to be happening in astrology right now is about Pluto, because in the tropical horoscopes, the tropical astrology, Pluto is has been doing this little bit of a dance in between Capricorn and Aquarius, and is going to be going straight into Aquarius for the next 20 years, I think sometime in mid to late November. And I was curious, and people are making this, it's going to be in Aquarius. And so a lot of folks are talking about the age of Aquarius and whatnot. And I was just curious, from sidereal point of view, where's Pluto? And is there any kind of similar shift?
Yeah, totally. Great question. So first of all, I want to address the whole age of Aquarius thing. So
Yeah, please.
we're not actually in the age of Aquarius
Right.
if you use true sidereal.
Right.
Okay. So the way that an age was usually depicted was where the sun is during the spring equinox. Okay. Now it's I got to do a little bit of bashing on the mainstream tropical here. So, it's tropical doesn't use the sky, but they do when it's convenient. And so here they're saying it's the age of Aquarius, but the truth is that if you use tropical astrology, it's always the age of Aries, and it never changes because the way you determine an age is where the sun is during the spring equinox. And again, remember, tropical is the fixed seasonal system, that it's always, the sun is always at the beginning of Aries during the spring equinox. That never changes. But the truth is that the sun is actually still well set in the true size of Pisces. So Pisces is a large constellation. So a true sidereal, we're using the actual size of the constellations. And this is actually different from mainstream sidereal and Vedic sidereal, which use an even 30 degrees for the signs. Okay. But if you take the actual size, which is how it was intended to be, the way our ancestors determined it, the sun is well set in Pisces and will be for another 700 years. So we are still at least 700 years until the age of Aquarius. Now, I will say, though, that since the late 1800s, very early 1900s, the sun has gone into the 11th house. So again, houses are different from signs. The 11th house, which means it's deviated 30 degrees from when it was actually sun on Aries. So when the tropical started, basically what would link the seasons with the sky. So 30 degrees from there does put it into the 11th, but this is a very different energy. Aquarius, being a sign, deals with the qualities of Aquarius, which would be things like progressiveness and vision, but those being things we're developing collectively. The 11th house, or houses in general, are the things. So Aquarius things are the 11th house. Aquarius things are technology. It is innovation. And if you use the true sidereal, it's crazy how accurate it is, that literally right at the late 1800s is right when we went into the Industrial Revolution. And it's actually the Industrial Revolution that started the 11th house transit. And again, that's going to go on for 30 degrees, which, is something like 2,500 years, right? When you factor it all out. So for a very long time, we're going to be in this 11th house. But yeah, not until about 700 years will we start to develop Aquarius qualities. Right now, we're developing Pisces qualities. I think this is important because ever since, so this whole, by the way, 2,000 years ago, so this is like the coming of Christ, but not only Christ, but like just before that was Buddhism and 500 BC and stuff. So this more kind of like spirituality that we've seen really get born, these past 2,000 years. In the West would be mostly, Christianity. These are the things of the age of Pisces. And I think we're still in this. I think this is important, is that over the next 700 years, it's still a very important time to grow spiritually. And that's what I think is happening with the collective. It's growing in ways of compassion, of acceptance, of peace, of, spiritual wholeness, soul, all this more. For those that know Pisces, it's basically the ethers of life and having more peace in life. That's really what we're supposed to be, I think, developing collectively, while in the area of technology and innovation, all that, since the Industrial Revolution. Okay, had to clarify that. With the Pluto thing, right? So as you asked, Pluto's not entering Aquarius right now. That's according to the seasons. If you look at Pluto right now with a telescope or an app, there's great apps now, you'll see it entering Capricorn. Now, this is very different. So the last time Pluto entered Capricorn was in the late 1700s, okay? And this was the birth of the United States, and it was also the birth of really the more republic and democratic forms of government that we have today. Because just prior to that, so for hundreds of years prior to the late 1700s, the West specific, but the whole world, but in this case, we just can talk about the West. The West is predominantly monarchs. So not so much that kind of innovative, kind of more freedom-oriented forms of government. So that's exactly what was in transition, because if you look from the late 1700s, and for what we would say would be Pluto in Capricorn, which is about generally 20 years, Okay. For those 20 years, that's where we saw rapid change in the structures and systems of society, both in political systems, which was in this case the monarchy to republics and more democratic run societies. We saw a huge change in economics from more mercantilism into more kind of what now has kind of crescendoed into more globalism. And even, of course, societally too, we saw huge changes with the Renaissance and all this culture and everything else too. So this is what I believe we are going to be experiencing for the next 20 years. Is very similar to what we saw from, and by the way, it was literally 1776 that Pluto entered Capricorn. So astrologically, where we are is in 1776. So if we start to think about those events and basically the timeline that, some countries are leading this thing right now, I would say the US and Britain again, but, in other places of the world, there's a lot of these kinds of really strong calls for more true liberty, true freedom, and things like this. We're basically having that same energy coming back. I don't think it's going to be like bloody or anything. So this isn't, I'm not fear mongering and saying, oh, we're going into another revolution. If we do go into a revolution or something, obviously it's going to be in a more, higher way, because I believe that with all these cycles, we're not just like, in school, they show the solar system. It's like this flat 2D thing. And it's just this, really what we're doing is flying through space, and that the sun is flying through space at we don't even know what speed, and the planets are just kind of spiraling behind it, basically. And this is symbolic for the spiral, in that even though we're kind of going through these same cycles, it's not a flat cycle like tropical is. Okay, I'm done. But more like a spiral where you're actually changing and evolving as we spiral around. So we're experiencing the same energies as the late 1700s, but of course not in the same way. We've grown a lot. We've obviously evolved a lot, and we're obviously going to take that with us in our new stage of change. But that's what it is. Capricorn is the foundations, and Pluto is the transformations. And so reading it collectively like that, the next 20 years, I think we're going to see a lot of changes to our systems and structures.
Yeah, I know that in both systems, then the U.S. is having their Pluto returned because that's based on the natal chart of the U.S., or at least one of the natal charts. Let's talk a little bit about the natal charts. Is there a difference, any kind of significant difference, other than what you're focusing on and the various signs that you may be in your natal chart? Is there any significant difference between the natal chart in sidereal versus tropical?
Right. So here are just the signs, right? So you can use different house systems. Like I prefer, for example, equal house, which just the reason is it's I think more fundamentally speaking to the fundamental self, but it also represents symbolically in the sky, and that it doesn't change the sky. So equal just says the highest part of the chart is the highest part of the sky, or the ecliptic in this case, when someone was born. It keeps it like that. So I do use a little bit of different energy. Like I use equal, whereas like quadrant systems like Placidus are more common in the West, and whole signs more common in the East. But outside of that, no, just with tropical and sidereal, it's really just the signs. This does change things like rulerships, though. So for those that know, like, if you want to get more information on, say, your what's called the chart ruler, your ascendant. And we said, like, if you're a Leo ascendant, then you're cultivating self-expression. That'll obviously be different because it's a sign. So you might be Leo in one, and then maybe, Virgo in the other, or whatever. And of course, the planet that's associated with that, or the ruler that's associated with that. So in this case, the sun is the ruler of Leo, whereas Mercury is the ruler of Virgo. So there is definitely some changes when you're reading it, professionally with rulers and things like this. But to keep it very simple, the only real difference is the signs. And we could say that the signs are like 1/3 of the chart. If you factor in houses, planets, and signs, that's basically what a chart is. So houses, the same. If you're using the same house system, it's the same between tropical and sidereal. Aspects are the same, right? Which is basically just how the planets are configured, like the conjunctions you mentioned. And then the signs, and then signs are the other part that's different. So it changes more of the signs. Now, the signs are the qualities, the parts of the self, like adjectives. You are expressive, you are playful, whatever. These are qualities. Outside of that, really the houses are the most important thing, I think, and aspects are quite important. So very, very similar between systems.
All right. Now, Isn't there in the sidereal an additional sign? We hear about that every now and then, that there's this 13th sign, and I will probably slaughter the pronunciation, but Ophiuchus or something like that.
Close. Yeah.
Yeah.
Ophiuchus, like few.
Ophiuchus. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Mm.
All right. Does that play a role in the sidereal at all?
Yeah. So, right. So where do I want to start with this? So we talked about the pre-Babylonians where things really started to diverge, right? I think because we've been practicing astrology far longer than we've had written language. Obviously, we've sat around the campfire and we looked at the stars. We noticed these moving bodies. We told stories under the campfire and all this, and that's probably went on. That's likely been going on for probably like 100,000 years, maybe. So a very long time. But of course, pre-Babylonian, we're talking like the birth of language and calendars. And so what happened at that time is there still is, like you can see in the ancients, a lot of symbolism to the serpent and a link, especially in Egypt, between the serpent and Ophiuchus. Okay. But what happened is the pre-Babylonians, started creating calendars. And the thing is that Ophiuchus is the 13th. Okay. And if you're trying to create a clock with 13 hours, or it would be easier to do it with months, wouldn't be that big of a deal. But you can really see how valuable it is to have 12 instead of 13 for a calendar or a clock. It's easily divisible. You now have quarters, you have halves, it's all nice and symmetrical. That's why I think Ophiuchus was removed from astrology. Neither Hindu astrology nor Western astrology uses Ophiuchus, but it is a literal constellation. Again, use an app, you can see it. It wraps right on top of Scorpio. So what's very interesting is that we would say, a dual sign with Scorpio, because with the path of the sun and planets, the ecliptic like this, you have Scorpio that wraps underneath. And then kind of like, let's say this is the beginning of the closer part of the ecliptic to Libra, you would have Scorpio coming up like this. But then Ophiuchus literally takes up the same amount of space on top of Scorpio. And then the leg of Ophiuchus dips below on this side. So if you were to look at it visually, you basically have the planets entering a Scorpio first, in the first half of Scorpio, and then Ophiuchus last with the second half of Ophiuchus. And that's how I have the true sidereal chart set up, because that is how it is visually. But in mainstream, they've removed Ophiuchus. Now, it makes sense to me because this system, again, works very much on even division. With both Western and Eastern astrology, they use an even 30 degrees for all the signs. Okay. Now, I will give a shout out to Eastern because, like I said, they have these more divisions like the nakshatras and the padas. And here they are actually using fixed stars. So they've stayed much more true to the true sky. But still, the signs themselves in both systems are 30 degrees each. And this is a nice, even, symmetrical thing. I get it from a human standpoint. We want symmetry. We want left brain structure. I get it. But if you are using the actual size of the constellations like we're doing with True Sidereal, then you absolutely have to use Ophiuchus. And there's conspiracies. Maybe it was removed on purpose. 13 is a very powerful energy. Ophiuchus is an extremely powerful energy. If you look at the Egyptian wall sculptures, Ophiuchus was like blacked out and like tried to be hidden or something. Like it's just a different color completely than the other ones. It's almost like it's this secret. And it's such a powerful energy symbolically, because what's at the very end of Ophiuchus is the galactic center, the center of the Milky Way. And again, if we're talking about cycles within cycles, of course, we get so much focus on our solar system. But we're part of a galactic cycle as well. The sun is orbiting around the center of the Milky Way. And that center of the Milky Way is at the very end of Ophiuchus. And when we see planets passing over that astrologically, which again, you wouldn't see in the other systems because they don't really plot it. I mean, they do, some of them do, but it's not like part of the system. Really powerful stuff, is happening to the world at that time. Now, it happens every year. Like the sun will pass through there every year, obviously, because the sun's going through there. But when it's the season of Ophiuchus, You can feel it. It's very deep. It's very powerful. Individuals who have like Ophiuchus sun or strong Ophiuchus in their chart, you see it in their personalities. It is the really deep, deep transformative energy of life. For those that know Scorpio, it's like the depth of Scorpio, but it takes it one step further in that it's not only aware of the depth, but it's actually working with it. And this is where we come to the symbolism of what our ancients gave the symbolism of Ophiuchus as the serpent bearer, the person wielding the serpent. And again, if we look at ancient times, the serpent, very symbolic, very powerful spiritually, and also, often used as a symbol for healing. And that's why Ophiuchus is also considered the healer. And again, with those prominent Ophiuchus in their charts, we can see, those that are into really deep spirituality, or on like a modern level, a lot of them are psychologists, doctors, modern day shamans, basically, who are wielding that serpent, so to speak.
Okay. So someone, for example, would be, instead of saying, oh, my sun is in Leo, they could say my sun is in Ophiuchus.
Right. But in this case, it's for those out there that have a sun in Sagittarius, your sun could be in Ophiuchus. Actually, there's a good chance your sun's in Ophiuchus.
All right. All right. Interesting. I know that this is probably a little bit backwards in terms of questioning, but I was just curious about your journey in astrology and what led you to the study of the true sidereal astrology. Is that where you started, or did you start with the tropical?
Yeah, so I started with tropical. Yeah, that's definitely the gateway for those in the West. And like I always knew sidereal was a thing. Like, and you can talk to, any Western astrologer, and they're going to be aware of what sidereal is, obviously, right?
Right.
But it didn't really hit me. Luckily, because of technology, it didn't really hit me until I downloaded. This was back in like 2012. I downloaded a star chart, which is an app where you can see the sky. And so I wanted to see where the full moon was. And so in mainstream, I think they were saying it's Gemini. I was like, I'm gonna go check out this sun in Gemini. Again, knowing what sidereal is, and it's just there, but I'm not like so many things in our life we just kind of take for granted. We don't really question and really dive into. So I was like, let me go see this sun, and this full moon in Gemini. So I go out there, I hold my smartphone to it, and it's in Taurus. And for a second I was confused, but then I was like, oh yeah, like tropical doesn't use the actual sky. And once it became visual like that for me, it just really stuck. And I kept practicing tropical for a little bit after that, but it just never really seemed right. And so I just got more and more for my own chart, more and more intrigued with my own chart, resonated much more with it, then slowly started to incorporate it into my work. I went from tropical to mainstream sidereal, and then with the same thing, mainstream sidereal, again, 30 degrees. So there's parts of like, say, Cancer in mainstream sidereal that are actually Leo. So again, you have a mismatch, and that didn't feel right. So yeah, I ended up with true sidereal, and then realized no one else is really doing it like full on. I had to create the boundaries, which are just the astronomical boundaries, because the astronomers weren't using the ecliptic. So we have what are called IAU boundaries, which still is surprisingly still used for true sidereal, even though it doesn't actually fit with the ecliptic. So that's where we came up with the midpoint system, which is using the actual, so it's using the ecliptic as the reference point, basically. And yeah, once that happens, luckily there's a software out there called Prometheus, created by Gavin Burns. Thankfully, he was around because, I'm not very technological savvy. So if this one software didn't exist, I wouldn't be able to do what I'm doing. I could if I was like using maybe a planetarium for my readings, but if I wanted like astrological charts and stuff, it's really the only one. So it's very serendipitous. It took a lot of things falling into place, but it's just a matter of time. I think now that technology has come out, we're able to now reference the sky much easier. I mean, look how hard it is to look at the sky now. And even as it was the past hundreds of years now, it's been light pollution and no one sits outside, no one goes outside anymore. So we just take these things for granted. But now that we have technology to like visually see the sky with these smartphones and stuff, and now programs where we can easily calculate the true size of the constellations. It's just, and then we're seeing this in every industry. We're going back to our roots and going back to what I think worked before, like, with our ancients and stuff, with healing, medicine, everything else, and going back to nature. And I see true sidereal as going back to nature and using the actual, visible sky in astrology.
Yeah, thank you for that, because that was what was on my mind. And I noted that it was somewhere on your webpage about kind of going back to nature, and it seems so important because we are so divorced from it. And maybe the tropical is an aspect of that, whereas it's almost imaginary in a sense. But when you go and look at the actual night sky, you're going to get a very different point of view.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Man-made things are great, but I think it has to be balanced with nature. I think generally humanity at this point has been diverged so far from nature that it's becoming destructive and not good for anyone's mental health or anything. And so we're returning to that because we have to. We do it or we die, collectively, I believe. So yeah, tools like this, I think, is a great stepping stone. I'm not saying this is the end all be all, or astrology even needs to be used. It's just a tool like everything else. But just like in every other industry, I think we're seeing that return to the natural world.
Yeah. I've only had a few episodes on astrology. I spoke to someone who was trying to kind of make the case for it, and I haven't published it yet, but I interviewed a archetypal astrologer. And I know a lot of archetypal astrologers, and I find it interesting. They just kind of throw out. They don't really care about the houses and the signs. They seem to be just more focused on the aspects that are happening at the time, which I suppose is one way around the problem. But it seems to me
no,
that,
absolutely. Again, it's it's the symbolism and the interpretation I think is important, and it doesn't matter what the medium you use for it. You can look at a glass from a bunch of different perspectives, and each perspective is going to tell you something. The same. You're still looking at the same thing, but it's giving a little bit more of that picture. And archetypal is great. That's what we need. We need more, I think, understanding of the elements and understanding of the fundamentals of life and things like that.
Well, I find it really interesting and quite fascinating. And it's part of our culture. And it seems to me that we want to understand it just from a cultural, symbolic level. It's part of our history, understand it that way. So I know that we are running out of time, but let me ask you my final questions. And this is, what do you have coming up next? What are you working on?
Yeah, so we're currently working on future reports. So right now we have natal reports. So if you go to the website, masteringthezodiac.com, I do recommend everyone just type in your birth details. You don't even need your birth time if you don't have it, and you'll see the sky when you were born. There's a little bit of an interpretation there. See if it resonates. Okay, just see if it resonates. Just something wild. Just try it out. And if you like it, we do have birth chart reports. And by the way, I'm happy to give your audience a discount to that. So if you go to masteringthezodiac.com/report-discount, that's report-discount, you'll get a 50% off the report if it resonates. There's a free version too, though. So check that out. But we're now working on future reports, which is not only able to look at the natal chart, but also the upcoming years. So what's going on in the next 12 months in particular for those cycles that we're in. And that helps not only understand who we are, but like how to incorporate that energy in the current energy, and with the current cycles.
Okay, wonderful.
So that should be out probably early next year.
Okay. And I believe you also have courses on your website, correct? For anyone who wants to learn more about this. Okay.
Yeah, so there's courses, mostly free content, videos, articles, and of course paid courses for those that want those as well.
All right. So that's masteringthezodiac.com. And for discount, it would be masteringthezodiac.com/report-discount.
That's right. And I'll send you the link if you want to post it.
Yeah, I will. When this publishes, I will put it in the show notes in the video description, and that would be very helpful. So
Awesome.
you had mentioned like the forecasting. I'm just kind of curious. Is there anything, and this, I apologize if it's a loaded question at the very end. Is there anything coming up that you see energy wise? Any kind of specific markers?
Yeah, yeah. So a lot of stuff has already started this year, like the Pluto and going into Capricorn.
Right.
It's very, very significant, obviously, right? But we've also had Jupiter and Uranus enter
Mm,
Taurus. So what I'm expecting here is like the next probably, well, Uranus is there probably the next 10 years, a lot of innovation in both the financial
mm,
and also in the natural. Taurus is the constellation that deals with material values. So
right.
that's like money, because that's just a symbol of resources. And then of course the natural world too. So a lot of innovation happening there. That's I think very big, for the next 10 years. And then we have still have Saturn in Aquarius. So things with technology really, we've started a new chapter with technology this year.
Mm,
Saturn cycles every 29 years. If you track this, the last time Saturn was in Aquarius was in the mid 90s, early to mid 90s, when we started the internet
mm,
revolution. I'm expecting the same thing with AI specifically. I know
mm,
everyone's talking about, but it's because as soon as Saturn went into Aquarius, all this AI stuff started to come out.
mm,
So what I'm seeing now is in a way a kind of a death of the internet and the way
mm,
we've been using it, and a complete rebirth of
mm,
the new internet, which is probably just going to be AI interface, which is going to take the whole 29 years to unfold, obviously, but
mm.
we're really starting to see the birth of that now. So yeah, there's a lot of things. We have eclipses coming up next month. The election in the States, for those that are interested, we have Mars going retrograde after that, which deals with having to redo some things. And so that's interesting. There's a lot we could go into, but
Yeah. Yeah.
basically big changes, mainly with
Okay.
those outer planets, those collective planets like you're
Yeah.
mentioning.
Yeah. If I understand correctly, I know from the tropical, they're all the outer planets are changing signs in the next
It's
year or
it,
so. Yeah.
it's actually synchronistically that's associated, because in true sidereal, not so much in mainstream sidereal, but in true sidereal, the fact that Pluto, Uranus, and Jupiter, well, Jupiter does it about every year anyways, but
Mm,
Jupiter was conjunct Uranus, which made it
right.
significant. So there was a lot of sign changes this year specifically in
Okay.
true sidereal as well. Yeah.
Okay. Wonderful. Well, Ethan, thank you so much for the conversation and sharing your knowledge about true sidereal astrology. I appreciate it very much.
You're very welcome. It was great being on, Nick. Thanks for
All
having
right.
me on.
And that's a wrap on episode 165 of Rebel Spirit Radio. Thank you so much for listening or watching if you're part of my YouTube audience. Now, you know what's coming up next. All the usual. Sign up for my Patreon, share this with friends and family, and on social media too, please, and subscribe to the podcast on whatever platform you use to listen to or view podcasts. You know the drill, but here's the thing. All of that is really important. Sharing, subscribing, following are all free, and they really do help. Right now, putting together this podcast is a labor of love, and I do love it. I'm in the process of making changes to improve the podcast and the YouTube channel. It's slow going, but your support will help me speed up the process and ensure that I can continue with the podcast and offer much more content than what I provide now. As I always like to say, I'm here in the Front Range now doing missionary work in regards to religion, spirituality, and ecology, psychedelics and consciousness, and how all of this can help us heal humanity's relationship with the sacred earth. So if you feel moved by the rebel spirit, and I sure hope that you do, then please, by all means, help me in my efforts to share the good news. I'm Nick Mather, and you've been listening to or watching Rebel Spirit Radio. Until next time, may it be at peace, may you flourish in all possible ways, and may you continue to nurture your rebel spirit.